On the edge of a quiet valley, where maple groves give way to open pasture, there stood a figure that had outlasted generations. From a distance, the Virgin Mary statue appeared small, a pale shape against the sky. But climb the dirt path to the hilltop, and you'd find her presence towering, carved in white stone, arms extended as if gathering every sorrow, every prayer the town had whispered into the wind. No plaque explained her arrival. No written record named the hands that had set her on the ridge. Yet for as long as anyone could remember, she had been there watching. To the people of St. Ignatius Hollow, she wasn't simply stone. She was their sentinel. The town itself wasn't much one main street with a diner, a feed store, a chapel whose bells had long ago rusted silent. But the hill was alive with footsteps. Couples came after weddings, carrying bouquets to leave at her feet. Soldiers leaving for war pressed folded letters into the cracks of her foundation. Mothers sat on the stone steps with infants in their arms, whispering blessings only she could hear. For 70-odd years, she had been the constant when everything else, the crops, the shops, even the families shifted and changed. Children were taught a rule before they were taught their prayers. You don't touch the lady on the hill. They said it in classrooms and on playgrounds, as if it were law. They said it with the same certainty as you'd say the sun would rise. There were stories too, each version changing with the teller. Some swore she was carried up piece by immigrants who had promised her a home after the war. Others said a storm had turned aside the very night she was placed, sparing the town from ruin, sealing her as their protector. Whatever the truth, one line threaded through all the tales: she was not meant to move. Visitors who came through often found the devotion strange. Why cling to a block of stone, they wondered, while barns collapsed and shops shuttered? But those who stayed long enough noticed something. The way farmers left apples and corn by her pedestal every fall, even in lean years, the way teenagers climbing the hill for dares always fell silent in her presence, laughter caught in their throats. The way old women, shuffling on canes, still climbed to place lilies at her feet every Friday without fail. And so the statue remained, untouched, untarnished, the closest thing the hollow had to a heartbeat. To most, she was comfort. To some, a mystery. But to all, she was permanent. At least, that's what they believed. Because permanence is only certain until the day someone tests it. And in the coming nights, a small band of desperate men armed with fire hotter than any storm the town had ever seen would march up that hill. They thought they would reduce her to ash. They thought stone could be melted, faith silenced. What they did not know was that the hill had never belonged to them. And what they were about to witness would sear itself into memory far longer than any flame could burn. It started, as such things often do, with talk in the wrong place at the wrong time. A bar on the outskirts of the county, dim and half empty, the kind of place where men nursed cheap whiskey not for the taste but for the silence it bought them. 3 strangers sat at a corner table, heads bent low, their voices careful. They weren't from the hollow. You could tell by their clothes, their accents, the restless way they glanced at the door. They were drifters, men who had known work and bursts and hunger in between. What drew them together that night was not faith, not family, but rumor. Someone, somewhere, had told them a story. Beneath the Virgin's pedestal, hidden deep within the stonework, there were valuables, coins donated in secret, offerings left over decades, even a supposed strong box sealed by the founding families of the town. It was the kind of tale that wouldn't make sense to anyone who knew the truth. The pedestal held no treasure, only the promise of the people who had built it. But desperation has a way of twisting whispers into certainties. And for men who had little, the thought of riches waiting under the statue's feet was enough to harden into a plan. The oldest of them, a man named Coyle, had the rough hands of someone used to tools, though not always for honest work. He claimed he knew how to break foundations, how to dig under stone without leaving a trace. The youngest, wiry and quick, said nothing most of the night but fingered a lighter as though reminding himself fire could solve any problem. The third, broad-shouldered, carried the kind of anger that comes from years of failure. He laughed at the mention of prayer, spat on the floor when one of the others crossed himself. To him, the statue was nothing more than marble, and marble burned if you burned it hot enough. And so flamethrowers entered the conversation. Not shovels, not hammers, but fire. Fire to crack the stone, fire to drive away any curious locals, fire to prove that no legend could stand against brute force. They knew it would be risky. Small towns noticed strangers on hills at night. But greed makes men bold, and in their minds the hill was no longer sacred ground. It was just a vault, waiting to be opened. Word of their intentions did not stay confined to that table. A waitress, carrying refilled glasses, overheard more than they thought. She said nothing, only watched their lips move, their eyes flicker. Later that night, she told her brother, who told a friend, who mentioned it in passing at the diner in town. By morning, a murmur had spread through St. Ignatius Hollow. Not a full warning, not yet just a shift in the air, an unease that made people glance at the hill a little longer as they passed. The strangers thought no one knew. They believed secrecy protected them. But the hill had always listened. And if the town was silent, the silence carried a weight heavier than any lock. In towns like St. Ignatius Hollow, trouble usually showed itself in small ways: strangers asking questions at the diner, outsiders walking roads no one used unless they lived there. But this time, the danger was heavier, louder, forged in steel and oil. The men who had set their sights on the Virgin's Hill did not come with shovels and pry bars. They came with machines made for war. It was Coyle who made the call. An old acquaintance from his years drifting job sites across state lines owed him a favor, the sort of favor men don't like to speak of in daylight. 2 days later, a rusted pickup rumbled into town with its bed covered by a tarp. Underneath lay canisters of pressurized fuel and 2 flamethrowers, their black nozzles glinting in the sun. They were relics, not military issue, but they work tested in a field just beyond the county line. When the trigger squeezed, a jet of fire screamed forward, loud and merciless, scorching the dry grass into blackened scars. The men laughed then, their nerves drowned under the rush of destruction. If fire could chew through earth, it could chew through stone. The youngest of them, the quiet one with restless hands, seemed almost enthralled. He traced the metal tubing like it was a sacred instrument, not a weapon. "Nobody'll stand in our way," he said finally, voice sharp and certain. The others nodded. Fear was an anchor they couldn't afford to carry. In their minds, fire was king, and kings bowed to no statue. Still, there were cracks in their bravado. The broad-shouldered man, whose anger often drowned his doubts, had spent a sleepless night after their test run. He told the others it was nothing, just dreams. But the truth lingered on his face. In the dream, the flames had recoiled, curling back like a snake striking its own master. He woke with burns on his palms, though he had not touched the fire. He didn't tell them that part. Some burdens are too heavy to share. Back in town, whispers spread faster than the men realized. A farmhand swore he saw shadows moving by the old quarry road, one of them carrying a shape too long to be a rifle. A trucker passing through noticed scorch marks near the field, black lines twisting in patterns like symbols burned into the soil. At the grain co-op, Ruth Kelly muttered to anyone who'd listen that something wicked is walking our roads. By sundown, half the town was watching the hill with unease. They didn't yet know when the strike would come, but they could feel it like a storm pressing against the horizon. The men believed they were preparing for a job of theft, but the tools they carried told another story. Flamethrowers are not instruments of silence. They roar, they consume, they declare their presence to heaven and earth alike. And if the statue had withstood storms, vandals, and the slow erosion of time, the fire these men carried would be its greatest test. Or so they thought. Because in the balance between flame and stone, there are forces no man commands. The night before the men would climb the hill, the hollow felt different. It wasn't a difference you could measure on a weather vane or a clock, but something softer, stranger. The air carried a tension, like a cord pulled taut but never struck. Those who lived close to the base of the hill said their dogs wouldn't settle, pacing in circles with their ears pinned back. Horses in the barns snorted and stamped as if something unseen had brushed their stalls. Cats vanished into the trees and didn't return until morning. At the diner, the late shift waitress stepped outside for a smoke and swore she heard a bell. Just one toll, long and low, vibrating through her chest. But there was no bell in St. Ignatius Hollow anymore. The chapel's tower had been silent for decades. She flicked her cigarette away and hurried back inside without telling a soul. On Willow Lane, Ruth Kelly lay awake in her narrow bed, rosary clutched tight in her hand. She was no stranger to restless nights, but this felt heavier. Her window rattled, though the wind outside was still. At 3:33, her clock blinked, and she whispered aloud without meaning to, "She's warning us." No one else was in the room, but the words did not feel wasted. Even those who didn't claim faith noticed peculiar things. A group of teenagers returning from a baseball game saw a pale glow on the hilltop, soft as candlelight, but steady, unwavering. They dared each other to drive closer. But when the headlights swept toward the slope, the glow vanished, leaving only the silhouette of the statue, still and unmoved. One of them laughed too loudly, but his voice cracked, betraying what they all felt. it hadn't been a trick of the eyes. The thieves, too, felt the weight of omens, though none admitted it. Coyle, checking the fuel tanks for leaks, found his lighter wouldn't spark. 3 times he tried, 3 times the flint ground uselessly. When he set it down, the boy picked it up and flicked it once it blazed instantly. Coyle said nothing, only frowned and went back to his work. The broad-shouldered man dreamed again, this time not of fire, but of a woman in white standing between him and the hill. Her eyes weren't angry, they were sorrowful. When he woke, his palms stung as if pressed too long against something hot. By dawn, the town stirred with unease that no one could explain. Neighbors lingered on porches, gazes drifting to the hill as though waiting for something to appear. Mothers pressed their children to walk faster to school. Farmers paused in their fields, shovels held midair, staring at the ridge that had always been familiar, but now seemed to watch them back. The omens gathered like clouds, uncounted but undeniable. And though no one could say it aloud, a single thought threaded through the hollow that night. Something sacred was bracing itself against what was coming. It was just past midnight when the men began their ascent. The valley lay in silence, save for the occasional chirp of a night insect or the far-off bark of a dog. Their boots crunched against gravel, muffled under the weight of the pack slung over their shoulders. Each carried more than tools. Metal fuel canisters clinked softly, straps dug into their backs. And beneath the tarps, the flamethrowers rested like restless beasts waiting to be unleashed. The hill wasn't steep, but the path was long. Locals could climb it blindfolded, their feet knowing every curve, every stone. But to outsiders, it wound like a serpent through the dark, narrow and uneven, lined with trees that whispered against each other in the wind. The thieves said nothing as they climbed. Even laughter felt dangerous here, as if the hill itself might hear them. The broad-shouldered man, usually the loudest, kept his eyes fixed on the dirt. The boy, restless and jittery, carried the lighter in his palm, flicking it open and closed. Each snap of metal was swallowed by the night, but still it seemed too loud. Halfway up, they paused to catch their breath. The valley stretched behind them, the faint orange glow of town lights, flickering like distant embers. From here, the statue was already visible, her pale outline luminous against the dark sky. Arms open, gaze lowered, she seemed to be waiting for them. None of them said it aloud, but each felt it, the unsettling sense that they weren't approaching her so much as being drawn toward her. Coyle adjusted his pack straps and muttered something about getting it over with. But when he stepped forward, the wind shifted. Not a strong gust, just a sudden breath of cold air sweeping down the slope, carrying with it the faintest smell of lilies. He froze. The others didn't notice. They trudged forward, their boots striking stone, their shadows stretching long under the thin wash of moonlight. As they neared the top, silence grew heavier. The crickets hushed, the wind stilled. Even their own footsteps sounded wrong, echoing faintly as though the hilltop were a hollow drum. At last they reached the clearing. The statue stood before them, towering, serene, her marble face untouched by time. To those who came here in daylight, she was comfort. To these men in darkness, she was something else entirely. The boy smirked, lifting his lighter. "Stone doesn't pray," he whispered, his voice sharp in the stillness. The broad-shouldered man shifted uneasily, but said nothing. And Coyle, pulling the tarp free, revealed the long black nozzles of the flamethrowers. The machines gleamed under the moon, crude, ugly things against the gentle lines of the Virgin's robes. For a moment, none of them moved. The statue loomed, silent, watching. Behind them, the valley slept unaware. Ahead of them, history, legend, and faith waited to be tested by fire. The hiss of fuel breaking free was the first sound to shatter the silence. One of the men tightened the strap around his chest, gripped the nozzle, and squeezed the trigger. A roar followed violent, unholy fire, screaming forward in a ribbon of orange and white. It struck the statue's base with a crackle so loud it echoed through the clearing, flames licking upward in a furious wave. For an instant, the night glowed like midday. Shadows of trees leapt across the hilltop, long and frantic, as if they too recoiled. The men grinned, at least at first. Fire was their ally, and it answered without hesitation. The broad-shouldered one laughed harshly, his voice caught in the roar. "See? Just stone," he shouted. But his words sounded small against the torrent. The boy swung his nozzle higher, sending fire arcing across the Virgin's robes, heat distorting the air until even her marble face seemed to ripple. Sparks leapt off the stone and scattered across the ground. Yet the statue did not blacken. The stone did not chip, nor crack, nor even dull. Instead, it gleamed eerily untouched, as if the flames had no weight, no bite. The men didn't notice at first. They were too lost in the chaos, the rush of destruction. But when the fire finally sputtered out, a pause fell, and they saw her as she had always been, white, serene, unmarked. Not a single scorch. Confusion crept in, subtle but sharp. Coil barked at them to try again. This time both nozzles roared in unison, their jets colliding at the statue's chest. The heat seared their faces, sweat dripping into their eyes, but the flames bent strangely. Instead of devouring, they curled, twisting upward like ribbons pulled by an unseen hand. Where they should have scarred, they scattered, breaking apart into harmless sparks before vanishing in the air. The boy cursed under his breath and pulled the trigger harder, as if force alone could make the fire obey. But the flamethrower coughed, sputtered, then belched smoke. A foul stench filled the clearing, thick and acrid, and the flame died midstream. He shook the nozzle, slapped the tank, but it was useless. His weapon hung limp in his hands, a dead machine. Behind them, the broad-shouldered man lowered his own nozzle slowly. His grin had vanished, replaced by something else, something like fear. He stared at the statue, her eyes lowered, her arms open, and for the first time that night, he swore he saw movement. Not a shift of stone, but a flicker, like the faintest glow beneath her gaze. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar of fire. The men breathed hard, sweat dripping down their brows, the stench of fuel clinging to their clothes. They had come armed with heat enough to consume barns, forests, even steel. Yet before them, the Virgin stood untouched, radiant in the moonlight, as if she had never felt a spark. And though none of them spoke it aloud, the same thought gnawed at each of their minds. Perhaps they had not brought fire to her. Perhaps they had brought fire to themselves. They tried again, and again. Each burst of fire was angrier than the last, as if desperation alone could change the laws of nature. The boy's hands shook as he primed the failing nozzle, cursing under his breath while fuel hissed from its line. The broad-shouldered man bared his teeth, his own flamethrower roaring so loudly that the leaves of the maples shuddered and curled. For a few seconds, the hilltop looked like a battlefield, flames boiling in furious streams, heat rising in shimmering waves. But the statue did not burn. The flames bent away, skirting her form as though an invisible wall shielded her. They twisted upward, splitting into harmless sparks that drifted like fireflies before vanishing in the night air. The harder they pressed, the stronger the resistance became, until it seemed as if the fire was recoiling, fighting its masters. The broad-shouldered man's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, so close the heat singed his coat, but the Virgin remained untouched. The more he raged, the calmer her marble face appeared. Then came the sound, a low hum, steady and resonant, rising beneath the roar of the flames. At first they thought it was the machines groaning, metal under strain, but no, it was clearer, deeper. It thrummed through the ground, into their boots, up their bones. The flames faltered, wavering as if confused. For an instant, every nozzle coughed, then spat only smoke. The boy staggered back, clutching the nozzle as if it had betrayed him. His eyes were wide now, not with triumph, but with something closer to terror. "It's not working," he muttered, voice cracking. She's not burning." Coyle swore and slammed his fist against the tank, but the older man's defiance had thinned. The statue gleamed white in the moonlight, brighter than it had any right to be, as though the fire had polished her instead of scarring her. The broad-shouldered man let his weapon hang at his side, chest heaving. He wiped soot from his brow, leaving a black smear across his skin. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "It's like the fire don't want to touch her." The words unsettled even him, and he turned away from the others, spitting into the dirt. They had brought the strongest weapon they knew, an element that had leveled forests and bent steel. Yet here, on this hill, in the presence of this silent figure, it was powerless. The fire that should have devoured instead retreated. The machines that should have obeyed sputtered and failed. In that silence, broken only by the faint hum that still lingered in the ground, the men felt something new coil in their guts. It wasn't defeat, not yet. It was fear, the kind that comes when a man realizes the world does not work the way he thought it did, and that maybe, just maybe, there are forces that refuse to bow to flame. They thought they were alone on the hill, just three desperate men and their machines. But St. Ignatius Hollow had a way of drawing eyes when it mattered most. From the tree line, half hidden in shadow, a pair of teenagers who had snuck up for a dare crouched low, their breath sharp in their throats. They had planned to carve initials into the railing, maybe leave an empty beer bottle at the base and laugh about it in the morning. Instead, they had stumbled upon the sight of fire arcing against the Virgin's form and stone refusing to yield. Neither boy spoke. The flames lit their faces in flashes of orange, wide-eyed and pale. Further down the slope, Ruth Kelly had come with her lilies. She always came on Friday nights, no matter the season. The walk was slow now, her cane digging into the dirt, but she still brought her flowers. That evening she had stopped halfway, uneasy, when she saw strange light dancing on the hilltop. She thought at first it was lightning, but the sky was clear. So she waited, heart pounding, and from her vantage she saw the shadows of men wielding fire and the statue standing unburned. She clutched her rosary so tightly the beads left marks in her palm. By the old cemetery fence, two farmhands leaned against their truck, smoking and talking about little more than the price of feed. When the wind shifted, carrying the smell of scorched fuel, one squinted toward the ridge. "You see that?" he whispered. At first his friend shook his head. But then came the sound, the hiss and roar of fire, followed by silence too sharp, too sudden. They stubbed out their cigarettes and said nothing more, listening as if the night itself had begun to breathe differently. The men at the top of the hill did not know they had an audience. They cursed, slammed their machines, roared into the darkness. And the statue stood untouched, her white surface catching the moonlight. To the hidden witnesses, the sight burned into memory with more force than any flame could. The teenagers would later admit that they felt a coldness rush over them, like water poured down their backs, the moment the fire faltered. Ruth Kelly swore she heard a bell 3 long tolls that rolled down the slope, though no bell existed. The farmhands would not even tell their wives, too afraid to admit that they saw a faint glow rise around the statue, blue and soft, like mist catching light. What none of them doubted was that something had happened, something they could not explain. And in the stillness after the fire died, the witnesses held their breath, waiting. Some prayed under their breath, some pressed fists against their chests. But all felt the same thing. This was not just resistance, it was answer. And though no words were spoken from the statue, the message was clear to every hidden soul who saw it: this hill was not theirs to take, not theirs to burn. Smoke clung to the hilltop like a shroud, thick and acrid, rolling over the grass in low waves. The men coughed as they staggered back, wiping soot from their faces, their flamethrowers sagging uselessly in their hands. For a moment, all was still, the machines silent, the flames gone. Only the sting of burned fuel left behind. Then the wind shifted, sharp and sudden, pushing the smoke upward. What was revealed made even the boldest of them falter. The statue glowed, not in the way marble catches moonlight, but from within, as if the stone itself had kindled a hidden fire. It was soft at first, a faint radiance threading through the cracks of the smoke. Then stronger, brighter, until her robes shimmered with a pale light, and her face seemed almost alive. Her eyes, lowered for decades, reflected the glow so vividly it looked as if tears of light pooled there. The boy dropped his nozzle. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the figure above him. "Do you see that?" he whispered, though the words barely left his lips. The broad-shouldered man swallowed hard, fists clenched at his sides, every ounce of his anger draining into a silence he could not break. Even Coyle, hardened and defiant, stepped back. His boots scraped stone, a sound too loud, too human, in the presence of something that no longer felt like mere marble. From the tree line, the hidden witnesses saw it too. The teenagers clung to each other, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken since childhood. Ruth Kelly gasped aloud, her flowers tumbling from her arms to the dirt. The farmhands, struck dumb, removed their caps without even realizing why. Across the valley, a few others claimed they saw the glow from their porches, faint but undeniable, like a beacon pulsing at the ridge. Then came the sound. Not a hum this time, but a bell 3 deep tolls, rolling through the night air as if struck from somewhere beyond the hill. The tones lingered, low and resonant, carrying into the hollow until even those who hadn't seen the light paused in their sleep, restless and unsettled. The men at the statue's feet froze. Their machines rattled uselessly in their arms, fuel hissing faintly, but no flame answered. The glow only grew stronger, pushing through the smoke until the hilltop looked like dawn had come early. The boy fell to his knees. The broad-shouldered man followed, his weapon slipping from his grip, forgotten. Coyle stood longest, trembling, jaw clenched as if to fight against what his eyes told him. But when the light washed over his face, painting him pale and small in its radiance, even he lowered his head. The smoke thinned, the glow held. And though no voice spoke, every heart on that hill, criminal or faithful, young or old, heard the same unspoken truth. Fire could not burn her. Darkness could not claim her. She was not moving. The glow did not fade quickly. It lingered on the statue's robes, soft and steady, casting long shadows across the grass. For the thieves, the weight of it was unbearable. They had come to desecrate, to melt stone with fire, but now the hilltop felt less like ground and more like a sanctuary. Every instinct they had to fight, to curse, to deny drained out of them, until nothing remained but awe and terror. The boy dropped first. He fell hard to his knees, the metal tank on his back clanging against the dirt. His hands shook violently as he pressed them together, though no prayer left his lips. He only stared up, eyes glistening, mouth open, as if trying to form words he no longer remembered. The broad-shouldered man followed, his bulk collapsing forward as though some invisible weight pressed him down. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders heaving, a sound between a sob and a gasp escaping him. Coyle held out longest, his jaw set, fists clenched. He glared at the Virgin, his eyes burning with defiance. Yet even his body betrayed him. His knees buckled, his chest tightened, and before he realized what he was doing, he too was kneeling. His lips curled, not in prayer, but in a grimace of surrender, the kind a man makes when he realizes he has been beaten by something far greater than strength. Below them, the flamethrowers lay discarded, useless now, their nozzles pointed toward the ground like defeated weapons. Smoke drifted from their tanks, a faint hiss escaping into the night, but no fire dared spark. It was as if the machines themselves had yielded. From the shadows, the witnesses watched in silence. The teenagers, still crouched, trembled not from fear of the men, but from the certainty that they were watching something holy. Ruth Kelly had fallen to her knees too, though she was half a slope away. Her rosary slipped through her fingers as she whispered an Ave Maria, her voice unsteady but unbroken. The farmhands removed their caps entirely now, pressing them to their chests, their usual roughness stripped bare. No one moved. The scene was still, as if frozen in sacred time. The only sound was the faint tolling of that unseen bell, 3 long notes that seemed to seep into bone. To the thieves, each toll felt like a judgment, first for their greed, then for their violence, and lastly for their arrogance in believing that fire could unmake faith. When the final note faded, the glow softened, retreating until the statue stood once more as pale marble under moonlight. Yet everything had changed. The men remained on their knees, unable or unwilling to rise. The witnesses, too, stayed rooted where they stood, breathless, shaken, knowing they would carry this night until their last. Because there are moments when a life bends, when a heart breaks open and can never close again. And on that hill, under the Virgin's gaze, thieves and faithful alike discovered that fire was not the only force that could consume a man. By the time the sky softened from black to gray, word had already spread. Stories don't wait for newspapers in towns like St. Ignatius Hollow. They travel on whispers, carried in the space between cups of coffee, in the glances neighbors exchanged before church. And by dawn, the whispers had grown into a current that pulled people toward the hill. At first, it was just a handful. Ruth Kelly, still trembling from what she had seen, guided by her niece's steady arm. Then came the farmhands, their boots still damp with night dew, caps tucked awkwardly under their arms. By 6 o'clock, families were arriving in small groups, their children rubbing sleep from their eyes as parents urged them up the slope. Some carried candles, some carried flowers, and some carried nothing at all. Only the pull to see with their own eyes what rumor had already declared. Fire had touched the Virgin, and she had not moved. The thieves remained at the base, silent, exhausted, their weapons scattered around them like relics of a lost war. They did not run. Perhaps they could not. Some said they looked dazed, as if the light still clung to their faces, refusing to fade. A few townspeople stared at them with anger. How dare they? But most gazes fixed on the statue. And there she was, white and serene, as she had always been. Her marble robes unmarked, not even stained with soot. At her feet, the grass, though trampled, bore no scars of fire. The air still smelled faintly of fuel, acrid and sharp, but there was no evidence of flames save for the scorched nozzles of the machines. Children craned their necks, expecting to see cracks or blackened streaks, but found only the same calm figure who had stood through storms, winters, and years of change. By mid-morning, the slope was crowded. Old men leaned on canes, murmuring prayers they hadn't spoken in decades. Mothers held their children close, whispering that they must remember this day. Teenagers, who had once joked about sneaking beers on the hilltop, now stood silent, their faces pale. And still more came, some walking miles on foot, others driving from the edges of the county. The hill was alive with footsteps, with voices hushed in awe. Father Brennan arrived just before noon, his cassock tugged by the wind. He climbed slowly, each step measured, until he stood before the Virgin. He pressed 2 fingers to his lips, then touched the stone as though confirming she was real, solid, unchanged. Then he turned to the crowd and said only one line: "The fire could not claim her." The words rippled like water across the gathered faces. Some wept openly, others dropped to their knees. Candles were lit, flowers laid, and by the time the sun rose high, Rosary Hill had become less a place of rumor and more a place of pilgrimage. The Virgin had not moved, and now, neither would the faith of the people who had watched her endure flame without flinch. By the time Sunday Mass arrived, the church could barely contain the weight of what had happened. St. Brendan's pews, usually half empty, were filled to the last row. Families who had not stepped through the doors in years came dressed in their best coats, children fidgeting nervously, eyes darting toward the windows, as though they expected to see the statue glowing even from here. The air was thick, not with incense, but with unease and anticipation. Father Brennan stood at the altar longer than usual before speaking. His homily, normally measured and clear, faltered at the edges. He had seen the statue himself that morning, pale and unmarked, the scorched weapons still lying abandoned at her feet. He had heard the bell toll, though he would not say it outright, and he had seen grown men drop to their knees, undone not by faith but by fear. Now, with the parish watching him, his voice carried both authority and tremor. "What happened on that hill is not for us to explain away," he said, hands gripping the pulpit. "It is for us to honor." The congregation murmured, a ripple of agreement, but not all faces were the same. Some nodded fiercely, lips moving in prayer, as if hungry for the word miracle to be spoken aloud. Others looked troubled, frowning as though faith was not enough of an answer. For every candle lit at the statue's feet, there were whispers that this was nothing more than spectacle, heat-resistant stone, faulty machines, coincidence spun into myth. In the front pew, Councilman Dwyer leaned back, arms folded across his chest. He had been one of the loudest voices for development, eager to see the hill turn into something profitable, something marketable. Now he stared at Father Brennan with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight. To him, the events were an obstacle, not a blessing. "Superstition," he muttered under his breath to the man beside him. "That's all it is, a trick of light and panic." But others weren't so quick to dismiss. Ruth Kelly, seated near the aisle, lifted her head and said clearly enough for those around her to hear, "I saw it. I saw the fire bend away from her like she was shielded. And I heard the bell. Don't tell me I didn't." Her voice cracked, but her certainty held. Several nodded in agreement, their voices rising in fragments of the same story, flames twisting, smoke lifting, light from nowhere. Father Brennan let them speak before raising his hand. Silence fell again, heavy but expectant. "Whether miracle or mystery," he said, "what happened cannot be ignored. We are bound to it now, every one of us. The hill is not just stone and soil, it is a covenant, and covenants are not broken without consequence." Some left the church renewed, clutching their rosaries tighter. Others left restless, muttering about mass hysteria. But all of them, no matter what they believed, glanced toward the hill before going home. And though the statue stood the same as it had for 70 years, something in the hollow had shifted. When the flames failed and the hill shone with light, the oldest residents of St. Ignatius Hollow did not see it as something new. To them, it was a reminder and echo of a vow made long before most of the town had even been born. They remembered the O'Connells. Or, if not remembered directly, they remembered the stories that had been carried like heirlooms through kitchens, porches, and Sunday suppers. Patrick O'Connell had been a veteran, returned from the Pacific with scars in his body and shadows in his eyes. His wife, Eileen, carried the weight of waiting months of not knowing if her youngest son, listed missing in Okinawa, was alive or buried beneath a foreign sky. And then, against all odds, word had come. He was alive. On the very night a storm turned from St. Ignatius, sparing the hollow from a flood that could have washed it clean, the telegram arrived. To Patrick and Eileen, it was no coincidence. It was salvation. Eileen spoke the words that would become the foundation of the hill's legend. She told neighbors gathered around her wood stove, bowls of stew steaming in their hands, "If you save our boy and you save our town, we will keep you here forever." And from that vow, the statue was born. Men carried stone in wagons, children hauled gravel in buckets, women baked casseroles to feed the workers. A sculptor named Mancini, out of work and nearly out of hope, carved the Virgin's face with hands that trembled from hunger, but steadied when the chisel struck marble. When the statue was finally raised at dawn, the whole town stood in silence, watching the first light crown her head. And beneath the foundation, Eileen slipped a folded paper into the mortar. For decades it remained hidden, until weather wore the stone thin enough to reveal the edges. The words were simple, written in her careful hand. "If you save our town, we will keep you here forever." That promise had not been forgotten, not by the elders who had lived through it, nor by the generations who grew up hearing it. And when the flames failed to mar the Virgin's robes, those words came back, sharp as if spoken yesterday. Ruth Kelly repeated them in the diner that morning, her voice trembling but certain. "It's the same promise." She remembered it. Others nodded, whispering the line like a prayer. Skeptics scoffed. Councilman Dwyer said it was nothing but folklore, a convenient story pulled from the past to dress up coincidence. But his protests sounded thin against the weight of memory. For those who had grown up climbing that hill, leaving offerings, whispering secrets at the Virgin's feet, the miracle was not an isolated event. It was continuity. It was covenant. And so, the O'Connells were spoken of again not as distant names in a dusty record, but as witnesses whose vow had reached across decades. The hill had not forgotten them. Nor, it seemed, had the Virgin. By Monday morning, the town was buzzing like a hive cracked open. Every shopfront, every porch, every diner booth carried the same story. The thieves had brought fire to the hill, and the Virgin had stood untouched. Yet while the miracle united many in awe, it also cut the hollow cleanly in two. On one side were the believers, those who had seen the light with their own eyes or trusted the words of those who had. They spoke with trembling certainty, voices lowered as if afraid the air itself might distort their testimony. Ruth Kelly repeated again and again that the flames bent like ribbons, curling away as though an invisible hand shielded the statue. The teenagers, their bravado stripped, admitted they had heard the bell toll, 3 slow notes that echoed in their bones. To them, the event was proof of what their parents and grandparents had whispered for decades. The hill was sacred, bound by promise, defended by something no mortal hand could touch. On the other side were the doubters. Men at the feed store muttered that the flamethrowers must have been faulty, the tanks half empty or corroded from neglect. Councilman Dwyer insisted the whole scene had been exaggerated by frightened townsfolk, that marble is harder to scorch than people think, and that fear makes shadows seem like light. A few even suggested the thieves themselves staged it, hoping to frighten the town and mask their failure. The argument spilled into every corner. At Tony's diner, farmers leaned across the counter, slamming down their mugs in frustration. "You weren't there," one snapped at another. "You didn't see the glow." At the post office, 2 mothers nearly came to blows. One swearing it was divine, the other calling it hysteria. On Willow Lane, neighbors who had shared fences for 40 years now crossed the street to avoid each other. Father Brennan tried to steady the tide, urging patience, urging reflection. "Faith does not demand explanation," he reminded his parish. But even his words fed the divide. Believers saw him as affirming their conviction. Doubters muttered that he was avoiding the truth. And in the middle were the fence sitters, those who admitted unease but clung to practical answers. They whispered about strange weather, tricks of light, overactive imaginations. Yet even they spoke softer than usual, glancing at the hill as if daring it to prove them wrong again. The thieves themselves were no help. When questioned, they stammered, contradicted, fell silent. Some said they refused to speak out of shame. Others claimed it was fear. Whatever the reason, their silence only stoked the fire of speculation. By nightfall, the hill had become more than a place. It was a line drawn through the town's heart. One side called it miracle, the other myth. But neither could deny what the flames had failed to do. The Virgin still stood, untouched, arms open, her silent gaze watching a community that could no longer look at her without questioning what they believed. As the days passed, stories multiplied. Each person who had stood near the hill that night carried home a fragment, and those fragments spread like sparks across the hollow. What made them powerful wasn't that they all matched perfectly, but that they couldn't be dismissed. Together, they painted a picture of something larger than any one account could hold. The teenagers spoke first, reluctantly. At school, their friends pressed them for details, and soon their whispers reached the ears of adults. "We saw the fire hit her," one said, his voice hushed. "It didn't burn. It curved away, like the air itself was pushing it back." The other added that he'd heard the bell, low and heavy, tolling 3 times from nowhere. When his classmates laughed, he only stared at them and said, "I wasn't laughing then." Ruth Kelly's testimony carried even more weight. She was known in town for her weekly lilies, her steady devotion. When she stood in the diner and told anyone who'd listened that she had seen the flames scatter like frightened birds, even the doubters fell quiet. It wasn't stone, she insisted, pressing her rosary against her chest. It was her. She chose not to be touched. Some wept hearing her words. Others frowned, uneasy, because Ruth was not a woman given to flights of fancy. The farmhands offered their version reluctantly, cornered by neighbors who demanded to know what they had seen. There was a glow, one admitted, tugging at his cap. Blue, soft, not like fire, not like anything I've seen, his friend added. And it wasn't just our eyes. We both saw it, clear as day. Felt it too, like the ground itself was humming under our boots. They swore no liquor was in their system that night, nothing to cloud their judgment. Even Father Brennan, who was careful with his words, confessed privately to another priest in Louisville that he had seen something move in the smoke, a shimmer around the statue's face, a light that made marble look alive. He would not speak it from the pulpit, not yet, but his silence in public only convinced many that he was holding back confirmation of what they already believed. And then there were the thieves themselves. Hauled into questioning, they avoided details, mumbling contradictions. But one guard later swore he overheard the youngest mutter in the cell. She looked at me. The broad-shouldered man said nothing at all, except once. When pressed too far, he whispered, "It wasn't meant for fire." None of it was meant for fire. The testimony spread until the town was saturated, every household holding some version of the miracle. Outsiders dismissed them as hysteria, as small-town folklore spun out of control. But within the hollow, it didn't matter if the details varied. What mattered was that they all pointed to the same truth. The Virgin had faced fire, and the fire had lost. They were not hardened men, not in the way legends describe criminals. They were desperate, worn down by hunger and failure, and that desperation had driven them to the hill. But after the night of fire, when the glow still burned in their memories and the toll of the bell haunted their dreams, even desperation could not keep their mouths shut. The sheriff kept them in the basement holding cell of the old municipal building. The walls were damp, the iron bars rusted, but the men didn't test them. They sat quietly, shoulders hunched, their eyes vacant. Days passed with little more than muttered words about bad luck and broken machines. Then, one evening, when the lights flickered during a storm and the shadows seemed too long, the youngest spoke. "She was there," he whispered. The deputy thought he meant the statue, but the boy shook his head. "Not the stone. A woman, in white. She stood in front of us." The fire bent around her like it couldn't touch her. His hands trembled as he spoke, tracing shapes in the air as though replaying what he'd seen. "She looked at me," he added, voice breaking. "And when she did, the fire died." The broad-shouldered man, silent for days, finally stirred. His voice was low, rasping, almost ashamed. "I dreamed it before it happened. She came to me, not with anger, with sorrow, like she already knew what I was going to do." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cold bars. "When the flames failed, I knew. It wasn't just a statue, it never was." Coyle tried to resist the pull of confession. He paced the cell, muttering about faulty fuel, about tricks of the light. But when the sheriff asked why his hands shook every time the church bells rang, he snapped. "'Cause I heard them first, all right? I heard the toll before they ever struck a rope. And I knew it wasn't a bell from here. It was something else. Something that wanted us to stop." His voice cracked, defiance leaking out like air from a punctured tire. He sat heavily on the cot and said no more. Word of their words spread quickly. Deputies talked to their wives, who whispered to neighbors, who carried it through the town by sundown. Soon, people repeated the thieves' testimony with the same weight as scripture. That a woman in white had stood between flame and stone. That her gaze had undone men who thought themselves fearless. That even in their darkest moment, she had not struck them down, but looked at them with sorrow. Some dismissed the confessions as broken men grasping for excuses. But others said no lie carried that kind of trembling. And for those who had already seen the flames fail, the thieves' words were not surprising at all. They were confirmation. Proof that what the people believed was not merely faith, it was witnessed even by those who came to destroy. In the days that followed the confessions, the hill changed. It was no longer just a place of stone and grass, no longer just a high point overlooking the hollow. It became something living, something luminous. Every night, without being asked, townsfolk walked the slope with candles in hand. At first it was only a dozen, then dozens more, until the path glowed like a winding river of flame. The Virgin stood at its summit, untouched and serene, her white surface gleaming in the soft light as though she herself had kindled it. Mothers brought their children to kneel, teaching them to whisper the promise once made by the O'Connells. "If you save us, we will keep you here forever." Fathers carried baskets of apples and corn to lay at her feet, as their grandparents once had. Teenagers came too, no longer for dares, but for silence. They sat at the base, the glow of candles reflected in their wide eyes, speaking softly as though afraid to disturb the air. Even skeptics climbed, drawn not by belief but by something heavier, something undeniable. The hill was not empty by day either. Volunteers cleared the path of weeds, laying gravel to steady each step. A wooden table appeared near the base, built without announcement, where people left handwritten notes and folded letters. Some were prayers, some confessions, some simply words of gratitude. Each night the pile grew, and each morning no one removed them, yet the wind never scattered a single sheet. It was as if the hill itself held them in place. Reporters arrived soon after, notebooks in hand, cameras slung across their shoulders. They expected shouting, protests, the kind of noise that sells papers. Instead, they found silence. Hundreds of people gathered without fanfare, their candles flickering in unison, their faces lifted toward the statue. What they captured in photographs looked less like defiance and more like worship. And when they asked questions about the fire, about the thieves, about the glow, most locals only answered with the same words: "Go see for yourself." The sheriff, though practical by nature, began walking the hill at dusk. He said little, but he came every night. The thieves, still in custody, refused food some days, staring at the floor as if reliving the glow again and again. One of them, the boy, finally asked for paper and wrote a single line before folding it carefully. She looked at me. When it was found, no one dared throw it away. It was carried up the hill and left among the other notes. By the second week, from a distance, the hill seemed to shimmer at night. Not from miracle this time, but from devotion, the candles, the offerings, the unbroken stream of footsteps climbing in reverence. Outsiders began calling it the Hill of Light. For those in St. Plains, for those Palm, Ignatius Hollow, it was simpler than that. It was home. It was promise. And now, more than ever, it was proof that some fires do not consume, they illuminate. In time, the flames became memory, but the memory never faded. People spoke of that night, not as rumor, not as a tale to be stretched and twisted, but as fact etched as deeply into the life of St. Pan. Ignatius Hollow as the stone of the Virgin herself. Children born years later would grow up hearing the same line whispered at kitchen tables and front porches. The fire touched her, and she did not move. For some, it was miracle beyond question. For others, mystery without explanation. And for a few, it was still coincidence dressed up by fear. But whether skeptic or believer, all agreed on one thing. The statue remained unburned, her white marble untouched. The thieves who had brought fire left behind not just their machines but their certainty. Their confessions, spoken in trembling voices, echoed longer than any courtroom sentence could. And the townspeople, divided before, found themselves strangely bound together not by debate, but by the fact that they had all been forced to look at something they could not deny. The hill became pilgrimage, not the kind printed on glossy brochures or marketed with signs by the highway, but quiet, personal, human. Families came at dawn, leaving flowers in silence. Strangers who had only heard whispers drove from hours away to climb the slope, standing at the base and waiting not for fire, not for bells, but simply for the stillness that seemed to breathe there. Reporters eventually stopped coming, their stories filed away, but the people kept walking, their candles burning long after the headlines faded. Father Brennan, reflecting years later, would say the miracle was not just that the statue did not burn, but that the town itself had been changed. The hill reminded them of who they were and of promises made long ago that still held power. Faith, he told his parishioners, is not always thunder. Sometimes it is stone that endures flame. Sometimes it is silence that answers louder than fire. And so the Virgin remained, arms open, gaze lowered, watching over a town that would never again see her as mere marble. Children who once played at her base now told their own children to lower their voices there, to carry flowers with reverence. Farmers, before planting, left baskets of seed by her feet. Even teenagers, restless and skeptical, found themselves pausing on late-night walks, glancing up just to be sure she was still there. The miracle did not erase hardship. The Hollow still faced lean years, storms, losses. But in every challenge, the memory of that night stood like a shield. Fire had come, and it had failed. And that was enough to remind them that not all battles are won by strength. Some are won simply by standing, unmovable, against the forces that would consume you. So if you ever drive the back roads of Kentucky and see a pale figure on the ridge, stop, climb the path, stand at her feet. You don't need to believe in miracles to understand why she still stands. You just need to listen.